Those of you who watch my model train videos will know that earlier this year, I scored a bundle of G-scale trains for $10, one of which was this Lionel Caboose. This is a unique piece that I'd like to add to my collection, but it has a few issues. Both couplers are broken off the trucks on the model, and the sliding door is missing the white plastic that's meant to act as the windows. The light inside the unit is also burnt out, and according to the guys at my hobby shop, this is nothing more than a Christmas tree bulb and is not made to take the kind of voltage that my G-scale power system puts out. So there's a bit of work to be done to this model to make it operational again, but I think I can pull it off. I'll start by disassembling the model and take off the railings and ladders at both ends. The roof needs to come off as well and is only held on by 2 screws just above the doors. Once the screws are removed, the roof comes off and allows easy access to the wiring inside. I'll remove the lanterns on the side of the Caboose as well, so they don't go missing while I'm working. They're a nice touch in my opinion, but it's a shame they don't light up like the ones on my Blockman Long Caboose. Then again, we're dealing with a model from the 1980s, and G-scale trains have come a long way since. Before I can remove the trucks, I first have to disconnect the wiring that runs from the powered pickups to the light. These were held together with wire nuts, and I'm not sure if this was done by the manufacturer or an individual. Either way, someone was obviously in here before I was. With the wires disconnected, I can remove the screws holding the trucks in place, and then set the Caboose itself aside. The first task I want to tackle is getting some new couplers on these trucks. It looks like originally there were screws holding them in place, but the plastic mounting posts had been broken. I can also see some evidence of glue, pointing to the fact that someone had attempted to fix this in the past. I'm going to be installing these Bachmann Knuckle Couplers, since these are what I use on my railroad. They easily fit in where the old couplers were, but will require modifications to the trucks in order to fit correctly. I'll need to install new mounting posts for the screws and also make sure the couplers are positioned correctly to allow clearance when coupling up to other stock or locomotives. So I have these plastic spacers left over from some of my 1/64 scale projects, and I found 2 that will work for what I want to do. I'll be gluing these in place once I determine where the couplers need to be positioned. Once I have this figured out, I hold the coupler in place and use my pin vise to drill a pilot hole for the new screws. With the holes as a guide, I can now go ahead and superglue the new mounting posts in place. I did have to use a file to remove a little bit of plastic left over from where the original ones were broken off. With the posts glued in place, I'll go back and apply some JB Quick Weld to them for extra support. I'll also fill in the broken areas, as I worry these may compromise the structural integrity of this piece. Afterwards, I found I had to do a final dress file in order for the couplers to fit without any interference. I managed to find 2 coupler screws in my parts bin, and using a drill bit just a little smaller than the screws, I drilled holes in both trucks to mount the couplers. The couplers were then test fitted to make sure everything lined up. I noticed the screws were a little long, and these will have to be trimmed down. I'll also need to add something in underneath to assist in centering the couplers. I'm going to be using 1mm styrene to do this. I scribe out and snap 2 pieces of styrene, which I then superglue to the bottom of the truck, just behind the first axle. JB Quick is also applied to these as well, as I fear they would break off without it. To somewhat hide the modifications I've made, I apply some black paint to these areas. The last thing to do is drill a hole through the styrene for the centering pin, which I took time to heat and bend upward so it doesn't rub against the axle and cause the wheels to drag. The coupler is then slid into place and secured with the screw, which has been shortened. When checking the coupler height, it looks good. With the new couplers installed, I can now go about putting the trucks back on the caboose and rewiring the light. As mentioned earlier, the wires were originally twisted together with wire nuts, but I'm going to be soldering them together instead. I start by tinning the wires, which makes them easier to solder together. If you're any good at soldering, that is. To insulate the wires, I'm going to be using liquid tape, as I find it's easier to work with. I apply a generous amount to the solder joints, and then wait for it to dry before moving on to the next step. Since the caboose has an opening door, I don't want the wires to be easily seen like they were before. To fix this, I'll tape the wires to the side of the caboose at the back. I later had to move these back further as this position interfered with the sliding door. With the wiring done, the new bulb is installed. So the last thing to fix is the missing white plastic in the sliding door. Originally I had planned to use a piece of styrene, but I found that the shade of white wasn't the same when compared to the sort of frosted look like the windows in the caboose already. After failing to find anything else around the house that would work to make a new matching window, I resorted to printing one out on cardstock. I matched the color in Photoshop, then printed out a square just larger than the windows. A matte clear coat was applied to give it that frosted look, then the piece was cut out and glued to the door. I decided to use a glue stick and go sparingly on where I applied it, in case I might be able to get an actual replacement window in the future. This way, it's easily removable. With everything done, I can now move on to reassembly. The sliding door is put back in place, and the lanterns are slid back into their slots as well. Something I just noticed is that these are incorrectly done, as the green lens should be facing towards the front of the caboose and not the side. Good job, Lionel. The roof is then put back on and the screws reinstalled. The railings and ladders were put back on as well, and considering the state this model was in when I got it and the fact that these parts are only a friction fit, I'm kinda surprised they didn't go missing before I got it. The final thing to do is wipe down the model to remove any dust or handling marks that may be on it. With the project finished, I think it's time to give this little caboose a run.